So we're going to do 4 things this evening to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the publication of Ulysses. The first thing we're going to do is that we're going to see a short 6-minute part of a film that is an interview with Sylvia Beach. So I don't know if you've heard of Shakespeare and Company bookstore in Paris, but it was founded by Sylvia Beach. She was an American. It was an English, it was a, do we need more chairs? It was a book that carried English literature and became the focal point for all the famous authors of the time. And everybody always says Ernest Hemingway, but there was the whole gang. There was Gertrude Stein and Alice Toklas would drop in. James Joyce would drop in. John Dos Passos would drop in. I mean, they were all drawn to Shakespeare and Company. And Sylvia had been running this bookstore for a while as a lending library and a bookstore. And then she got to know James Joyce, and she'll tell you a little bit about that. And then he said to her one day, "No one will publish my novel, my great novel." And she said, "I will." She'd never published a book in her life. She had absolutely no idea what she was doing. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more, but for starters, I just wanted to kind of help you understand where Sylvia Beach is in this process. She was the actual first true publisher of the book Ulysses. And in this interview, she's 72, I believe, and is looking back a little bit. If you have a chance, I would like to give you a link to the entire video because it's 20 minutes long and it's just full of priceless stories, like the night that when Ernest Hemingway showed up, the day Paris was
liberated.
Relieved of Germans. What is the term? Liberated. Thank you. When it was liberated, and how Ernest Hemingway came and hugged her and threw her around in circles and said, "What can I do for you?" And she said, "There's these German snipers on the roof." And he said, "We'll take care of it." Ernest Hemingway runs upstairs and kills all the snipers on the roof. Did that really happen? Well, you know, it's probably an apocryphal story, but anyway, I'm going to switch it over. So help me.
Yeah. And while she's switching it over, I just took a peek. We took bets on who was going to attend tonight because we've had a snowstorm, and we have, I think Kathy Grace won. We have over 15 people that came for cake and another 18 of you on Zoom. So way to go, James Joyce.
Electra, share screen is disabled right now.
You need to turn it back on to share screen. And I'm sorry I'm not masked, everybody. I am double vaxxed, but I don't think you'll be able to hear me if I'm masked the whole time.
Good now.
This is the little video, Joe, if you want to make your head around.
Okay.
Wednesday to this visit to Ireland for the joy celebrations must have brought you back in memory of a great many highlights of your life. I hope you'd like to tell us something about them.
Yes, this great event in this James Joyce Tower opening brings me back to the days in 1922 when I published Ulysses by James Joyce in my little bookshop called Shakespeare and Company in Paris.
Yes.
I started life in a Presbyterian parsonage in Princeton, New Jersey, where my father was a Presbyterian pastor of the First Presbyterian Church. We lived in a street called Library Place. And in the pews of my father's church, you'd see an ex-president and his family, Robert Evelyn, and a future president and his family, Woodrow Wilson. I left Princeton and went to Paris during the war, the First World War. And I was studying in Paris and teaching a little too. And I used to frequent a shop of a French friend of mine named Adrienne Montigny called House of the Friends of Books. And there I met all the French writers, and I knew them before I ever had a bookshop of my own. And it was my friend Adrienne Monnier who encouraged me to open a bookshop in Paris. And I really was not prepared for such a thing at all. I knew nothing about business and a little about books, and I only loved books very much. And I couldn't fully foresee the success of this place and how its life would be eventually. I didn't imagine such a thing as having James Joyce frequenting it, in and out the door, nor Hemingway and those people, but they were hardly anywhere to be seen at that time. But I opened my bookshop, and already I had all these young Americans who were pouring into Paris from America, and they were disgusted in America because they couldn't get drink. It was prohibition, and they couldn't get Ulysses. I used to think those were two causes of their discontent. They were thoroughly frustrated, and of course Ulysses was the work that they were all they admired the most. And think how annoying not to be able to get it anymore. And it was being suppressed in a review called The Little Review. And two women there, it was always women who were publishing Joyce, and they were trying to publish this thing, and it was suppressed. And finally their review was suppressed, and they were called off the prison for it.
Well,
All on
suddenly,
account of Joyce.
suddenly you, from being a bookseller, a very famous bookseller, you suddenly decided to go into publishing.
Yes. You see, I met Joyce one day at a party that I wasn't supposed to attend at all, as I wasn't invited. But Adrienne Monnier took me, and it was the house of a French poet named André Spear, who was a friend of Ezra Pound's. And Ezra Pound had just lured Joyce and his family to Paris, and he had him invited to this party, and so we were really, both of us, uninvited. And when I got there, the host, André, spit in my ear, the Irish writer James Joyce is here. So you see, he must have known already the importance of James Joyce. And I was so frightened, so scared, and I never thought I could meet him in the flesh, and it seemed terribly frightening. And I thought at first I would run home, but I didn't. I stayed. And I met Joyce, and Mrs. Joyce was there. I met Nora Joyce and liked her very much. And Joyce was sitting at the table, and Ezra Pound was teasing him with putting all the wine bottles and all the glasses in front of his place, and he wasn't drinking a drop. And this was because he had vowed not to drink until nighttime. But Ezra knew this. Nobody else could understand the point of that joke. And after lunch, when they were discussing all kinds of problems in French writing, I went into a room off the dining room where André Spear had a lot of books piled up. It was his little library. And leaning in the corner against the bookshelves was James Joyce, drooping. And I went up to him boldly and spoke to him, and we had a conversation together. And he seemed very much interested in my bookshop. He said, "What do you do?" And I said, "I have a bookshop." "Oh, well, have you? Give me the address." And I told him it's Shakespeare and Company, and it's 8 Rue du Puitrin, Paris 6. And he took this all down, peering very close at it because his eyes were not good. And I was very much impressed with Joyce. I thought I'd never seen anyone so interesting and so fine. He seemed very sensitive, terribly, and very, very interesting. And some people asked me, "Were you disappointed when you met James Joyce?" And I always say, never at all, for he was anything but disappointing.
And then he brought along the manuscript, the typescript of Ulysses to you.
Yes, well, he used to tell me about what was going on in New York, and he was following this case where the Ulysses was being suppressed. And finally he came one day to show me this little review, and he said, "You see, this is now being completely suppressed, and my book, as he pronounced it, will never come out." So he sat there with his head in his hands, and I said to him, "Would you like me to publish Ulysses?" And he said, "I would." He was seemed very much relieved, in fact. Why, I don't know, because it wouldn't inspire confidence in anyone who had such a book that he'd taken 7 years to write, to give it into the hands of someone so inexperienced and young and just a kind of a little bookshop, not a publishing house at all.
And now we're going to switch over to our presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Our tech guru. So can you hear me okay on the screen?
Yes, perfectly.
Alexa, can you hear
And
me?
everybody, if you can't hear, just send me a text.
Okay, thanks. And everybody in here can hear me, right? So she's sweet, isn't she? I mean, she's such a personality. What happened today, 100 years ago, is that she was standing on a railway platform in Paris, waiting for 2 copies of Ulysses to be handed her by the porter, who was on the train from where Monsieur Darentier, the printer, had finished only 2 copies so far. And her goal was to get those 2 copies into James Joyce's hands by sundown, because it was his birthday, his 40th birthday, and he was hugely superstitious around special events like that. So for her to put that book, his book, finally in his hands was terrifying, that it wouldn't show up, but it did. She got the books and she ran to Joyce's house and knocked on the door and handed him these books, which must have been fascinating because the first 2 books were full of typographical errors because they did this so fast. One of the things that a lot of people don't know is that the printer of Ulysses did not speak a word of English, and yet it was in English. And so he was literally setting words based upon the script and not upon any kind of feel for what the flow of the language was. So that kind of introduces you to Sylvia Beach, but I am going to, there we go. But let's go back to when Joyce wrote the book. So this is him as a young man in Dublin. He was determined to be a writer. He left his family early. It's a hard story because he left his very drunken father with Joyce's younger siblings, and he just walked away from his family instead of trying to help his siblings, which when you read that, you're always kind of going, oh, you should have stayed. But if he'd stayed, would he ever become a writer? It's doubtful. So he did, and Reed will probably fill us more in on his background between now. He may be able to fill us some background between his youth in Dublin and starting on Ulysses. But he did end up in Switzerland and working on, started Ulysses in the First World War. So he spent 7 years working on the book. It was a book that he intended to create a whole new way of writing, a whole new style of literature, and to cross every boundary he possibly could, from language to descriptions, sex, toilet talk, everything. He was determined to hit the boundaries and create a whole opening for future literature. He knew he was doing this. And that's what's remarkable. He wasn't just concentrating on his work. He was concentrating on future work as he was writing. So it was the First World War. He was in Switzerland. His family would come and go. They were in deep poverty. Word started getting around through the world that Ulysses was being written. This was going to be a world-changing novel. So people would send the Joyce family money periodically. They would move into the nicest hotel in town, spend their money like crazy until it was gone, and then they'd move back into these horrible little apartments and just survive. Joyce was undergoing numerous eye surgeries. He was in very ill health much of the time. Poverty didn't help. And yet he managed to write much of Ulysses during that 7 years. He also eventually moved to Paris at the urgings of his friends. And okay, why am I not, where do I hit? Oh, there we go. Oh, thank you, dear. She's my tech helper, my tech expert. This is Nora Joyce. She was Nora Barnacle when they met. And that was how she introduced herself, as Nora Barnacle. And she provided the muse for much of Ulysses. She was a very, very independent thinker, but she wasn't really much interested in her husband's writing, which is kind of sad. The day that he handed her her first copy, she offered it up for sale to anybody at the table who wanted to buy it. She was tired of it. I can kind of understand that after all those years. This is Ezra Pound. Ezra Pound was the ultimate champion of Ulysses. He was the one who corresponded with Americans. He corresponded with people in the UK and in Paris, and he made sure that people got money to Joyce and understood what Joyce was doing. He was a poet himself, as I'm sure many of you know, as well as a critic and supporter of all modern arts. So eventually Ulysses was published by this woman in the Little Review, which I'll show you here, a magazine for the arts. Her name is Margaret Anderson. She lived in New York City, and she was determined to create new roads of literature. So she and her partner published the Little Review. They published Yeats. They published many of the poets and playwrights of the time. But when they were handed Ulysses, they knew they had something that was going to get them in trouble. But they kept going. They published 3 chapters of Ulysses in the Little Review until finally it got the attention of the post office. This is unexpected, isn't it? The Comstock laws were created in 1873, and this was what Anthony Comstock wrote to keep information about birth control, about abortions, about sex, about anything relating to the human body out of people's hands. The laws were initially written in 1873, and over the years, the penalties for such publication were increased. He bragged that he burned 7.82 tons of books in his lifetime. And that doesn't even include the literature that, was like pamphlets and brochures and things. So he was almost single-handedly, as a postal inspector, responsible for what Sylvia Beach very sweetly calls suppression at this time. This was their society, the New York Society for the Suppression of Vice. And there they are, burning books, and putting people in jail. So Margaret was taken to court, and she was represented by this man, John Quinn. John Quinn is a fascinating man. He was a rabid collector of modern art. He literally had canvases stacked all over his house, and not always on the walls. They were just everywhere. He loved Matisse. He loved Gauguin. And he, thanks to Ezra Pound, loved Joyce's work from the standpoint of its idea. He didn't actually like the writing. He read Ulysses and he thought it was kind of gross. And a lot of us sometimes do. I mean, there are some gross words and some gross situations in Ulysses. He recognized that and he didn't like it. He also thought that Margaret Anderson was an uppity feminist. But because it was right, he put everything on the line. He was about to argue in the Supreme Court on a completely different case. He set that aside and went and defended Margaret Anderson and lost. Margaret Anderson went to jail for 6 months, and John Quinn paid her a $1,000 fine. She stopped printing Ulysses at that point. And this was 1921 when this happened. And now Ulysses was nowhere until Sylvia Beach. There's Shakespeare and Company. Sorry, it's not a very good picture. It's a very, very old picture. I've described it to you as a bookstore. It was also a lending library. And young Sylvia, I think she kind of fell in love with Joyce. She and Adrien Monnier were lovers, but Joyce was a really kind of a sexy guy. He was also very mysterious and also very needy. So when he came to these women, Margaret Anderson, well, he didn't physically go to her, but through Ezra Pound, and physically went to Sylvia and said, I need your help. I don't know what instincts took over, but their nurturing instincts took over, and they were going to help him succeed. So there's Sylvia and Joyce shortly after the publication of Ulysses in Shakespeare and Company. So there's a copy of the first edition. I have to just throw this out really fast because I just find this fascinating. This is the paper cover. This is not like a paperback, like a thick paperboard that you see on a paperback. This is just paper. And if you'll be gentle, I'm going to pass this around. This is a first edition of Ulysses. Pardon me?
And make sure hold these things in front of the camera too.
Okay, I will. I will after it's passed around. And so one of the things that James Joyce particularly wanted was for the blue of the Greek flag to be on his book. And so the printer had to go to Antwerp to find this blue. So that's why I'm so excited that Kendra so beautifully captured the blue in our cake over here, because it really was important to Joyce. So this is called a lithograph production, so that they basically did a metal plate with the title and his name, and then inked over it with the blue. And so the white, as you'll see on the cover that you're passing around, is just the paper showing through. Oh, wait away. So, well, I'm showing him too soon. So for 10 years, 12 years, Ulysses was being purchased in Paris by people, snuck into the UK. One woman tried to print it, and all the copies were burned on the dock in the UK. People were sneaking copies into the United States. There was one salesman who was in Canada. He got a box of copies, and then he would go into the United States once a week with copies of Ulysses in his pants. And so he slowly but surely started filtering it into the United States, but just 2 copies at a time, so it's pretty slow. Finally, this man, Judge Woolsey, in 1935, read Ulysses all the way through and wrote an opinion that ended with, Ulysses is now allowed into the United States. So this is a story as much of courage, of conviction, as it is the conviction of people who wanted to keep people from reading what they felt was wrong. And of course, we're seeing that again, aren't we? And even though then it was the Puritan ideals of sex and home and family and women staying in their place, we have a whole different set of issues now around our current suppression, as Sylvia would say. So that is a bit of the history of how Ulysses ended up in the United States and in the UK. And then, of course, eventually it was translated into so many other languages and became generally published. One guy decided he was going to publish Ulysses well before it was even admitted. So he went through and cut out all the dirty parts. And when they finally went to print a full printing of Ulysses, they accidentally used his version, the first few hundred copies, till they realized what had happened. All right, I'm going to take this off of and go back to people again. So again, if anybody has any questions, please interrupt and say so. So the next thing I thought that we'd do is I have some paragraphs from Ulysses. And I was hoping I could persuade some of you who are present, in fact, we could probably turn the lights back on, to read them out loud, read some of them out loud. So is there anybody who would be willing to take on a paragraph of this incredibly difficult but interesting novel? All right. So I'm going to give you the very first paragraph of the book. Sure. And then what we're going to do is we're going to turn the here we go. Doug, would you like one? All right.
And who's listening while we're waiting can tell me what the Bloomsday Festival is that's held in Dublin and on what day, which
Here.
was my daughter's birthday. So I'm very happy about that. Anybody know?
Anybody over here want to read? Okay. And then I need a woman to read this last one, because this is the last paragraph. There is no punctuation. It's stream of consciousness. No, that is
you have
mine.
a favorite passage that you like?
Yeah. It really is. Do you mind if I just real quick show it to the Zoom audience and I'll hand it back to you? So one of the things that we're passing around is this. This is a first edition, 7th printing. Oh, it's upside down. No, it's not. 7th printing of Ulysses. So as you see, the blue paper, and this is just paper. This isn't paperboard. This is the same paper as the rest of the book. And then people would cover it with leather or some other kind of binding. So that blue, the famous blue that was such a huge hassle for the printer,
Jeanette, can you
from
give
Monsieur
us
Darentian, is right there.
the history of the blue again and let everybody know your experience with printing? But can you give us a history on the blue?
I talked about a little bit earlier about how the printer had to go to Antwerp to get the blue.
Right. Why was it so important, that unique blue?
James Joyce had the Greek flag hanging off of his apartment. And he really, what's happening? We're seeing somebody else's screen.
Well, keep going.
Okay. Anyway, he loved that Greek flag. He loved Greek independence. And so he wanted his book to be blue. He mentions Greece a few times, but not a lot. So it's kind of one of those things where you knew that it was very much a personal need, not necessarily translated very easily to everybody. One other thing I do want to mention before we start reading, as the proof pages went back and forth between Sylvia Beach and James Joyce, he rewrote the book almost completely. So poor Mr. Dardentier would get a whole page print set, and then James Joyce would change everything. And you have to remember, this is metal type that they are setting one letter at a time. Finally got to the point where he'd leave half the page blank because he knew he was going to move everything. So I just feel for the man. He must have been patience personified. All right. So do you think you could do the turning thing?
Yeah.
So we're going to start our readings. Are you ready?
Or maybe I'll turn it this way.
Okay. Do you want help with the Latin before we start?
Entrego ad altare Dei.
Perfect. Whenever you're ready.
Deborah, could you stand up and come closer to this so everyone can hear you? I know that you're a great speaker and I'm putting you on the spot. By the way, Deborah Moore is another great author.
Come on over here. His light's not there.
It
Can you
won't be
see
there
her okay?
anymore. Should be good now.
Can you see her okay, Electra? Electra?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, okay.
I was eating cake.
Okay. Stately, plump Buck Mulligan came from the stairhead, bearing a bowl of lather on which a mirror and a razor lay crossed. A yellow dressing gown, ungirdled, was sustained gently behind him on the mild morning air. He held the bowl aloft and intoned, "In Trebo ad altare Dei." Halted, he peered down the dark winding stairs and called out coarsely, "Come up, Kinch, come up, you fearful Jesuit." Solemnly he came forward and mounted the round gun rest. He faced about and blessed gravely thrice the tower, the surrounding land, and the awaking mountains. Then, catching sight of Stephen Daedalus, he bent towards him and made rapid crosses in the air, gurgling in his throat and shaking his head. Stephen Daedalus, displeased and sleepy, leaned his arms on the top of the staircase and looked coldly at the shaking, gurgling face that blessed him, equine in its length, and at the light, untonsured hair, grained and hued like pale oak.
Lovely. Doug, why don't you go next? Can you step up to where you are? Sure.
Something like this.
Perfect.
The caretaker put the papers in his pocket. The barrow had ceased to trundle. The mourners split and moved to each side of the hole, stepping with care around the graves. The grave diggers bore the coffin and set its nose on the brink, looping the bands round it, burying him. We come to bury Caesar. His Ides of March or June, he doesn't know who is here nor care. Now, who is that lolly-looking galoot over there in the Macintosh? Now, who is he, I'd like to know. Now, I'd give a truffle to know who he is. Always someone turns up you never dreamed of. A fella could live on his lonesome all his life. Yeah, he could. Still, he'd have to get someone to sod him after he died, though he could dig his own grave. We all do. Only man buries, no ants too. No, ants too. First thing strikes anybody, bury the dead. Say Robinson Crusoe was true to life. Well, Friday buried him. Every Friday buries a Thursday if you come to look at it. Oh, poor Robinson Crusoe. How could you possibly do so? Poor Dingham, his last lie on earth in his box. When you think of them all, it does seem a waste of wood, all gnawed through. They could invent a handsome bier with a kind of panel sliding, let it down that way. Ah, but they might object to be buried out of another fellow's. They're so particular. Lay me in my native earth, a bit of clay from the Holy Land, only a mother and a dear-born child, dead-born child, ever buried in one coffin. I see what it means. I see. To protect him as long as possible, even in the earth. The Irishman's house is his coffin. Embalming in catacombs. Mummies, the same idea.
Nice. Thanks, Doug. Why don't you go next?
The nymph. I do. You bore me away, framed me in oak and tinsel, set me above your marriage couch. Unseen, one summer eve, you kissed me in 4 places, and with loving pencil, you shaded my eyes, my bosom, and my shame. Bloom, humbly kisses her long hair. Your classic curves, beautiful, immortal. I was glad to look on you, to praise you, a thing of beauty, almost to pray. The nymph. During dark nights, I heard you praise. Bloom, quickly. Yes, yes, you mean that sleep reveals the worst side of everyone. children perhaps accepted. I know I fell out of bed, or rather was pushed. Steel wine is said to cure snoring. For the rest, there is that English invention, pamphlet of which I received some days ago, incorrectly addressed. It claims to afford a noiseless, inoffensive vent. He sighs. 'Twas ever thus. Frailty, thy name is marriage.
Ah,
The nymph, her fingers in her ears. And words, they are not in my dictionary. Bloom, you understood them? The use, shh. The nymph covers her face with her hands. What have I not seen in that chamber? What must my eyes look down on? Bloom, apologetically. I know. Soiled personal linen, wrong side up with care. The quoits are loose, from Gibraltar by long sea long ago. The nymph bends her head. Worse, worse. Bloom reflects precautiously. That antiquated commode wasn't her weight. She scaled just 11 stone 9. She put on 9 pounds after weaning. It was a crack and want of glue, eh? That absurd orange-keyed utensil which has only one handle. The sound of a waterfall is heard in bright cascade. The waterfall. Pulafuka, 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 pulafuka.
nice. That's very nice. So we're starting to get a feel for the language, I think. I haven't really gone into what Ulysses consists of and why it's written that way, because that's what Reed is going to talk about. But that's why I thought it'd be fun for us to explore the language a little bit with these readings. We've got a couple more. I was first introduced to reading out Ulysses out loud by my friend Jane Wodening, who gathered us all over here in Nederland at Stu Horowitz's house, and we would all read Ulysses all day on June 16th, which is Bloom's Day. And we would read and eat and read and eat, and it took us 7 years to get through the book. One day per year. And it was just a fabulous experience. My friend Lucy Strook, who is in her late 70s, I believe, read the brothel scene better than anybody I've ever heard. So next, would you like to go? Okay.
Can you see me? Okay.
Yes, this is great.
All right. Only once more that soap. He went down the house staircase. Who the deuce scrawled all over those walls with matches? Looks as if they did it for a bet. Heavy, greasy smell there always is in these works. Lukewarm glue in Tom's next door when I was there. He took out his handkerchief to dab his nose. Citralemon. Ah, the soap I put there. Lose it out of that pocket. Putting back his handkerchief, he took out the soap and stowed it away, buttoned into the hip pocket of his trousers. What perfume does your wife use? I could go home still. Tram. Something I forgot. Just to see. Before. Dressing. No. Here. No. A sudden screech of laughter came from the Evening Telegraph office. Know who that is? What's up? Pop in a minute to phone. Ned Lambert it is. He entered softly.
Nice. So who else has one besides Carol? Your turn. Thank you.
Hope this is this one. Oh, Mr. Bloom, how do you do? Oh, how do you do, Mrs. Green? No use complaining. How is Molly those times? Haven't seen her for ages. In the pink, Mr. Bloom said gaily. Millie has a position down in Mullingar, you know. Go away. Isn't that grand for her? Yes, and a photographer's there, getting on like a house on fire. How are all your charges? All on the baker's list, Mrs. Green said. How many has she? No others in sight. You're in black, I see. You have no. No, Mr. Bloom said. I have just come from a funeral. Going to crop up all day, Arthur C. Who's dead? When and what did he die of? Turn up like a bad penny. Oh, dear me, Mrs. Green said. I hope it wasn't any near relation. May as well get her sympathy. Dignam, Mr. Bloom said, an old friend of mine. He died quite suddenly, poor fellow. Heart trouble, I believe. Funeral was this morning. Your funeral's tomorrow while you're coming through the rye. Diddle diddle diddle, dum dum, diddle diddle. Sad to lose the old friends, Mrs. Green's Woman Eyes said melancholy.
Nice, very good. That's great. So the last reading we're going to have, Carol, you got the most challenging one, is the very last well, it's not really a paragraph, the last probably 20 lines of the book. Molly's stream of consciousness chapter is completely unpunctuated, 45 pages of unpunctuated stream of consciousness thought. And some people feel it's the most beautiful prose ever written in history. And I tend to agree. And this is the very end of it. Carol, you ready?
Yeah. And oh, that awful deep down torrent. Oh, and the sea, crimson, sometimes like fire, and the glorious sunsets and the fig trees and the Alameda Gardens, yes, and all the queer little streets and the pink and the blue and yellow houses and the rose gardens and the jessamine and geraniums and cactuses and Gibraltar as a girl, where I was a flower of the mountain, yes, when I put the rose in my hair like the Andalusian girls used, or shall I wear a red? Yes, and how he kissed me under the Moorish wall. And I thought, well, him as another. And then I asked him with my eyes to ask again, yes. And then he asked me, would I to say yes, my mountain flower. And first I put my arms around him, yes, and drew him down to me so he could feel my breasts, all perfume, yes. And his heart was going like mad. And yes, I said, yes, I will, yes.
Fabulous. So we flip around now, Elise. Thanks. All right. Oh, there
It'll
we
be
go.
back on, don't worry. Just a second.
So I think we're going to have Reed ready to share with us in just a moment. Reed, if you're ready.
Yes, I'm ready.
Okay. So Elise, just let us know when we have,
Yeah, I will.
our live audience can also hear and see if possible.
Can you give me a sense of how much time I should take up? And
I think a good 20 minutes would be great.
Okay, good. Thank you.
And again, please, everyone, feel free to ask questions both via Zoom and also in person.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you very much.
Trying to get the sound up.
Really nice to be here. Thank you, Electra and Jeanette, for organizing it, and Jeanette for that wonderful framing of the publication. And it was so important to hear that. There's so many frames to this book, and that's a great historical one.
I'm going to ask him to hold on.
Can you not hear me?
I'm sorry, Reed, can you hear me? It's
Yes.
Jeanette.
Yes.
We're having a little sound issue here. So
Okay.
the audience can't hear you that's present. So could you hang on one minute and let us get this straightened out?
Okay.
We don't want to miss anything.
I'll put on these headphones too with a little.
Okay, Reed, you're on. So now you can entertain us in the interim. I told you to have something ready. Where the juggling, the.
Oh yeah. Well, I'm going to play with these headphones.
Okay, that's not a
You need to
spectator
move.
sport. We're going to lose all our Zoom.
Okay, sorry about that.
Thanks, Elise. Under pressure.
Fixed. We're fixed. We're good.
Okay.
Reed, you're fine.
Reed, we're ready for you.
Okay, I'm going to.
And you're in a
Could you
cardigan. I just have
This
to.
might be better. Can you hear me okay now?
Do you hear us?
I can't. Oh, not with these on.
Take them off, Reed. It was on our end that we couldn't hear, so you can take them off. Okay, I think we're all good.
You hear me now all right? Yes?
Yes.
Yes, okay. All right, I don't know if you heard me thank Electra and Jeanette, but I wanted to be sure to start with that, thanking them for organizing this and the spirit with which it's been organized, and also the initial framing of the publication of the book that Jeanette ran us through, and the interview with Sylvia Beach. All that is really a great way of concentrating, I think, an event like this, of a group of people and the attention on the some really concrete historical aspects of the book, which is very helpful, because as soon as you start reading it, that's another story in terms of what the experience is. I wonder how many people actually read it in all that history. It sounds like the judge in 1935 read it, but he may have been one of the first people to go through it all. I'm just wondering, because it must have been so radical then. It's difficult still 100 years later. So I was, I didn't know what to try to do in 15 minutes with this book, where to come at it from. But given the fact that we're a varied audience with different levels of experience of the book, maybe none at all, maybe many readings, I thought I would try to say something from my experience with it about how you can enter into it, what kinds of general trends in the writing I could maybe introduce a bit to make those a little bit more familiar, and then the mind of the reader able to find some handholds and footholds and grain in which to ride the work. Those are wonderful readings. You can tell it's great writing because it's, even though the sentences and lines are so often fragmentary in their references and mixed in their voices and places of register in the mind, this still comes out fluid and rhythmic, and everybody found that somehow when just now when you read your various passages. So that's important to know, and it's a good thing to have faith in, because you can ride those rhythms as you read as well, and they will carry your attention as reader through passages that basically seem completely incomprehensible. But you can feel it. Yes.
You have to apologize. We had terrible mountain manners, and I don't think we introduced who you are, other than the man with the great bookcase.
That's all right.
We're all wondering who Reed is. Jeanette.
Let's do that. We'll do that at the end.
Okay, so please let them know your experience with poetry and poetic language.
Okay.
That's why.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm a poet in Boulder, and I've been living here since 1969, mainly here. And I've taught at Naropa University for more than 20 years. And I've taught this book, Ulysses, a number of times there, and read it myself before that, and taken part in also a group at Jane Wodning's house in Denver, first reading Ulysses on Bloom's Day, June 16th. And then we took it on more as I think it was probably 4 or 5 get-togethers a year lately, and moved through it probably a little over halfway again. So I'm not a scholar, but I have read the book quite a lot, and I have a love for it and a pretty good feel for it myself. Whether I can, that's the difficulty, is transmitting that to someone else. One of the principles of this time, which is called the beginning of this era we call now modernism, right, basically at the turn of the 20th century. And just before that, it's not just then, things have been developing and moving towards this point, which happens to be roughly at the turn of the 20th century, this millennium. But in virtually every field of human endeavor, every science, every art, history, geology, music, dance, painting, philosophy, you can almost name any field and see that around this time, within say 50 years, either side of the 20th century, every basic premise of that field was being upturned and reimagined. And so one sort of general principle that you could use to think about how if there is any common thread of the unsettling of all these fields of human thought and commitment, religion too. One of the binding principles is that of discontinuity. That is, things seem to be whole. They seem to be related in their parts and whole and move together. But every time you look into any situation, whether it be the rocks of the strata of rocks in a rock formation, the frames of a moving picture, the makeup of genes in the genetic code, notes and music, sounds and poetry, everything breaks down into smaller and smaller units that have gaps between them, mathematics as well. So nothing is really continuous in an integrated sense. Certainly things flow on, there's streams, you could say, but even in water, there are molecules and atoms and small subatomic parts that are distinct units that when you continue to break them down, turn into just energy, not units at all. And this is what is happening in all these fields. And one of the primary ones, of course, is physics itself, with Einstein and his theory of relativity, looking at the composition and makeup of time and space in their interrelated connections to matter itself. So all of this world is being unsettled in terms of its foundational premises at this time. And that's why this book is written, I think, in the way that it is, why somebody like Joyce would be inspired to attempt to register mental phenomena and even the characteristics of personality in their incremental or fragmentary levels, and somewhat deconstruct and demystify the sense of a person being a whole integrated thing, or the universe being one whole integrated thing, or religion involving one whole integrated thing, and so forth and so on. So what I wanted to start with here, I wanted to, again, not get too abstract and just talk about other things in light of the book, but the book itself and the way that it's composed and the way one meets it as a reader and then gets to know it over time as a reader, become acquainted with it, and become, you could say, unified or connected, interconnected with it in terms of your own mind moving, that it moves with the book in a fairly unified way. So first I thought to ask ourselves, do we meet our own experiences subjectively, or do we meet them objectively? And I think most of us would agree that we do both. We have the facts and events of our experience that have fairly distinct characteristics and shapes. And then we quickly have our ideas about those things, our feelings about them, their memory relations to other things, all that kicks in, and we suddenly are in a very subjectively oriented position vis-a-vis that thing. So in terms of writing and narrative, up till this point largely, but not exclusively, some novels going way back explored consciousness directly in characters. But for the most part, the realm of realist fiction, which was the movement in the 19th century in novels and stories, was to attempt to portray a real character in a real ordinary world operating, but from the point of view of a narrator talking or telling the story. So you never got necessarily directly inside or there wasn't the attempt. Maybe it didn't seem possible. Nobody knew how it could be done, maybe, or few people, to enter into the moving mind of a character and get that intimate with a character, so that they don't just represent qualities or be types, seem to be types of people in relation with each other, but you're actually into the confusion and the clarity at times and the emotional tendencies of a human being. And so this is also the time that William James writes, just before the 20th century, his big first book called Psychology, looking at the stream of consciousness. That's where we get that phrase, how consciousness moves in time. As he put it, it has periods of flight and periods of perching. So consciousness rests with certain things at moments, and then it takes off again, or something takes off again, and it moves, it jumps. And Freud, of course, is writing in 1900 his interpretation of dreams, wherein he first delineates the conscious mind from what he called the pre-conscious mind, and then the subconscious mind. So now we have a sense of the human mind being multi-strated, some of which can be known and some of which cannot be known. And that part that can't be known still works and creates and puts forth things. And those things, those intuitive things, are caught, some of them, by the preconscious and subconscious mind, and sometimes they're recognized, sometimes they create their own emotional and mental patterns themselves. But the sense of a character now, if it were going to be realistic, has to be that kind of reservoir of intelligence and awareness and confusion. So how do you now present a character in a work of fiction? So one of the means towards this, which had also appeared earlier in writing, but which Joyce would use, is known as the interior monologue, where you enter into the moving discourse, interior discourse of a character's mind in any given moment or period of time. And in that way, if it's convincing, it may not be. It may be pretty artificially done, but if it can be done with a real feeling, and this is what Joyce is pretty remarkable at, you buy it. You're persuaded that you actually are. It feels real. It feels like you're touched somebody's inner movements of consciousness, even though it could be very discontinuous in terms of what it's presenting. It's not that things aren't coming out in whole sentences necessarily, or whole ideas. They get interrupted, they get replaced by new ones, but it has a sense of something happening in an authentic way. So that's one method, and in some of the passages we heard read just now, you can hear that the mind interrupting itself with a new thought or a new sense perception coming up, and how that the mind continuously is gathering and moving from and into references and realms of perception without periods and capitals in the transitions. So it takes a lot of fine work to be able to register in writing and in print that kind of movement, so that it doesn't seem contrived or artificial, but it actually feels something like the way your mind works and moves and jumps. Likewise, the question of who's telling the story is questionable now. The idea that there could be a consistent or ongoing or trustworthy, believable narrator mediating the story being told and delivering it to you, the reader. Who is that person? Where did they come from? Where do they exist? It's not necessarily the author pretending to do it. It's some kind of teller of the story. But that requires a kind of artificial construction as well, because in order to get to the character's mind, we don't necessarily want that mediator, or you can't have direct access to a character's mind if there's somebody mediating in between. So the writing has to somehow now appear to touch those moments of the character's mind directly and spontaneously, without mediation. So again, different methods of narrative, of telling stories, are experimented with. One is called, you probably know, some of you, this term free indirect discourse, whereby the teller of the story is continuously merging with the character mind of the character in being presented, so that it's more like the character's mind is somehow expressing itself as the story, with a little help from the writing of the story. I'm not sure if I said that very clearly, but it's pretty subtle, and it again kind of dissolving apparent roles in the telling of a story, so that in the end, ideally, you have the feeling that this story is telling itself, and that in fact the book has its own mind. And that's the point I think Ulysses actually gets to, where the easiest way to describe what's happening is to say that there's no author apparent, no narrator apparent, only the writing itself as revelatory of these living so-called characters, who are, you could say, nodes of consciousness rather than people, or maybe one step below, calling them persons, that they're nexes or nodes of consciousness, filtering and receiving and transmitting energy in the form of thoughts and feelings, emotions, angers, and so forth to each other.
Reed, will you also talk about the catechism narrative style, and putting that in context again, as you initially mentioned, with what was going on theistically in the world?
Well, okay, but that's one specific episode late in the book where that's used. I think it's the Ithaca episode, right? Where
right. Electra's asking you this question. Please note that.
That's fine. No, I'm just saying that almost every episode has a completely different narrative presentational style. So I don't know about jumping to one. That's a good example of it. There in that episode, it seems to be taken both from catechism, Catholic catechism, where the student is questioned formally about their knowledge of scripture, but also from the way that scientific books were written for children in the 19th century, say a book on geology or weather formation and so forth. You would set it up with a disembodied question, and then the answer to it. So it seemed to be in a kind of conversational presentation. But I don't think I want to get any further just into that, because again, these every episode is handled very differently. But overall, I think what I wanted to say is, or sort of push toward, is the experience of the reader having to encounter all these styles of presentation, and how in the midst of it all, you still come through with a feeling that you're really getting to know these characters very intimately, almost embarrassingly intimately, as which is the reason why for the censorship. Because this is daily life, one day, and we all know that, right? That the span of this novel in time and space is one day, actually one day plus a night, June 16th and June 17th, 1904 in Dublin, Ireland. Yeah, so this is how I think you can feel a holistic engagement with the book on the basis of the growing, incrementally, frustratingly, but growing intimacy with these characters as you see them in various facets and glimpses. So that level of the book where the objective sensory perceptions of the characters are foremost, are extremely finely written. I'll give an example. Here's just as we meet Leopold Bloom in episode 4, he runs out, he gets up, goes down to the kitchen in this narrow, I think 3-story home he lives in with his wife, Molly, and their daughter, up till now anyway, I can't think of her name, Millie. And he's going to start making breakfast, but realizes he doesn't have any kidneys. And Molly likes a kidney. And he goes through and remembers that the mullen, the lamb, what's the word? Lamb, what? Mutton, thank you. The mutton butcher is closed that day, but so he goes to the pork butcher, which has its own irony since Bloom is half Jewish in Dublin, and there is a distinct anti-Semitic level of prejudice there, as there was throughout Europe at this time. But he's going to go to the pork butcher and get a kidney for Molly's breakfast. He comes back, and this is just a paragraph. He puts the teapot on the kettle on the hob. On the boil, sure enough, a plume of steam from the spout. He scalded and rinsed out the teapot and put in 4 full spoons of tea, tilting the kettle then to let the water flow in. Having set it to draw, he took off the kettle, crushed the pan flat on the live coals, and watched the lump of butter slide and melt. While he unwrapped the kidney, the cat mewed hungrily against him. Give her too much meat, she won't mouse. Say they won't eat pork. Kosher. Here. He let the blood-smeared paper fall to her and dropped the kidney amid the sizzling butter sauce. Pepper, he sprinkled it through his fingers ringwise from the chipped egg cup. And it goes on, of course, but that loving attention to detail, and again, how a narrator, there's a good example, I think, of this indirect discourse in the narration where you're not in Bloom's thoughts exactly, but this is Bloom's sensibility you're feeling in the language. There's no separation, nobody in between. So that kind of objectivity is very fine in Ulysses, as well as then the question of the subjective responses in our consciousnesses to the objective world we meet and engage every day. So there I wanted to, well, let me mention that, I'll just say that Leopold Bloom, our 3 main characters are Leopold Bloom, his wife Molly. Leopold is a kind of semi-employed ad salesman for the newspapers. He tries to canvass companies and businesses for ads to sell in the newspaper. And but he's not doing very well, and he seems to be distracted a lot of the time. Molly, his wife, is a singer, a professional singer in Dublin and in the environs of Dublin, and has an active singing career in opera, light opera, so forth. And their daughter Millie is just turning 15. She's off on a photo shoot on the coast. So they're kind of concerned about how she's doing, what's up with her. That's on their minds. And I won't say any more about them because that's the story. But and then the third character is Stephen Dedalus, who we met at the beginning there in that first reading from the opening of the book, who is a kind of artist, intellectual, poet, but all potential, not much done yet. But he thinks of himself that way. And he's quite a, he's quite a copy of the young Joyce, self-consciously and ironically presented. He's going nowhere at this point in Dublin. He doesn't seem to be able to relate well with other people in the arts world or any other world. He teaches school, young boys, a boys' school. He teaches English, but he's clearly not. His heart really isn't in that. So he's quite discontented and alienated from his social world. So those are the three characters, and they seem, some people say that they form a holy, modernist holy trinity or holy family, which isn't far off the mark, but it's just one of many layers you can apply to that, the relations between those characters. Stephen and Molly and Leopold haven't met each other. There was one incidental meeting when Stephen was a child, but nobody remembers that, I don't think. So that's the question too. They don't know each other, but the story's about the three of them somehow. And so we're privy to each of them in different episodes, some more than others. But mainly it's exchanging episodes between Stephen's mind and Leopold's mind for the first 17 episodes of the book. And then, as was mentioned, we're suddenly fully into Molly's conscious, unconscious mind as she's falling asleep. So anybody have any questions at this point before I go on? And maybe if anything I haven't been clear about.
It's Electra again from Ithaca. I have a question, but you can maybe save it for the end. I really would love to hear from what you open with. You're talking about the subjectivity and objectivity, and I would love to hear when you finish, because of your experiences also as a professor, how you feel technology is really changing for our new young thinkers and readers, that division between the two, and how today's immersive technologies, immersive reading experiences, how that's affecting that. So maybe something to simmer on when you finish.
Okay.
I'd be fascinated to hear your perspective on that. Okay,
let's see if it turns that way. I don't know that I can say very much about that. So there's that level of being inside the confused states. We could say confused, not as a pejorative sense, but just the way it moves, the way our minds move between seeing something and thinking something and feeling something and getting lost in a mood about something, then seeing something else. The way that somewhat continuously runs our normal consciousness. And how challenging it might be to present a character in language, writing, with that kind of world being exposed and shown. So that's one thing that's going on always in this book. And then the other is that it jumps further from the sort of dedicated, committed, and totally well-informed world of Dublin, Ireland at this time. And Joyce worked with telephone books and address books and everything to make sure that and he would write to people back in Ireland, since this was all written in Italy and Paris and Switzerland. He would write to friends back in Ireland to have them measure the distance between a building and a curb or a railing or something, just so that everything was almost exact. And he once said that he wanted the book to be able to offer a rebuilding plan for Dublin if it was ever destroyed. You could build it back up as it was from the details of Ulysses. But from there, the mind doesn't just respond to its own sense perceptions and reactions to them, but it makes other correspondences. And this is what is also extremely notable about Ulysses, and it's why it's first announced on the book's title page. Why would this be called Ulysses? Why would a story about three people in Dublin, Ireland be called Ulysses? So there's that kind of conundrum and provocative correspondence between things is also deeply the nature of the book and the reading of the book. It's quite an education if you read Ulysses and track down every correspondence or many correspondences. You go throughout world literature and of all kinds. So you could treat it that way. It could be used that way too, as a means of cultural education, widespread cultural investigation. But here, at this way, this is kind of that was more or less the ground level subjective, objective presentations of character mind in Ulysses, that first part, and now it moves to other layers or levels of movement, energy levels that engage and invite many correspondences with other cultural iconic references, people, historical people, books, the Bible, Shakespeare. It seems to go on and on and on and almost be endless in its movement of connection between sources. And in fact, there is never a final beginning or end to this book. It really feels as if you've entered into a span of attention with all multiple connections happening as they do, and then you've left that phase and the book is done. One of the most helpful things I've seen, I think, in terms of relating the structure and composition of Ulysses to a larger sense of the reality structure is through a quote from Werner Heisenberg, an early theoretical physicist and student of Niels Bohr, and a little younger than Einstein, but a student at that point when Einstein was presenting his theories of relativity. And Heisenberg said, in a kind of summational way, the world thus appears as a complicated tissue of events in which connections of different kinds alternate or overlap or combine and thereby determine the texture of the whole. That's a very kind of precise and clear way one could describe the way Ulysses is put together and experienced, I think. All the events seem to be interpenetrating in some way. They glance off each other. They don't become the same as each other, but they certainly invite comparison and relation to other events and other times and other characters. And then inevitably, I think at that point, if you feel that way about it or get to know it that way, your own world is now part of that book. Your own mind works along with the things you're reading in the book, so that it invites reactions and so forth from your subjective and objective consciousness as well. Engagement there. One in one episode of the book takes place in the Irish National Library in Dublin, where Stephen Dedalus has gone to meet some literary companions of his and poets. And he's presenting an argument that he has. He's a theoretical argument that he's worked on to do with Hamlet and Shakespeare. And it never comes exactly quite clear what that theory is, but it has to do with Shakespeare and Hamlet being father and son. And of course, it dissolves the apparent boundary between the creation and the biographical author. So, which is something that's happening all the time throughout here anyway. These arbitrary or apparent divisions between the mind of the writer and the work being written or created aren't as solidly separate as we usually think. So he's making a theory that Shakespeare's Hamlet's father, and that Hamlet, the king, who was Hamlet's father in the play, and Shakespeare have a natural affinity with each other. They share experiences of jealousy and so forth. And yeah, anyway, that goes on and on. But at one point there, he says about Shakespeare, he found in the world without as actual what was in his world within as possible. I'll say it again. He found in the world without, the exterior world, as actual what was in his world within as possible. So it's a nice, this is the logical mind of Joyce playing with logical constructions, but you can hear the without, the exterior word and actual word put against within and possible. The world without, the world within, the world as actual, the world as possible. So where does the relation he's asking, I think, or suggesting between the possible world of the artist's mind being realized as, not in, but as the actual world? Does a creative act, maybe such as this book, become an actual world in your own experience reading it, as actual or perhaps more actual than the world you think of as the world?
Reed, that may be a great way to start closing up, because we're hitting
Okay.
7:30 and we're going to have to wind it up. And
Okay, sorry, I didn't realize.
No, and any questions that anybody has, we have about 5 minutes on the Zoom, and then some people are going to socialize here a little bit with some.
Okay, may I just mention one more thing on this reference that I was referring to here in the book? Would that be okay?
Oh, yes, of course.
Okay, so he continues that he says that thing about the world within is actual, the world without is possible. And his next thought is, every life is many days, day after day. We walk through ourselves, meeting robbers, ghosts, giants, old men, young men, wives, widows, brothers-in-law, but always meeting ourselves. So I'll maybe that is a place I could leave it off at. That the implication there being that these mind constructions, are they imaginary? Are they real? Is my affinity with something that I feel an imaginary thing? Is it a real thing? Am I that person when I think of them? Does subjectivity work that way? Anyway, I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much, Reed. We really appreciate that.
Okay.
And it makes me want to read the book again. I read it a few times, but hearing your perspective really helps.
Well, I think it's a matter of going with the play of it, and that's done, like I mentioned before, largely on the rhythm of the writing. That's a very important part, connecting there, and then beginning to feel familiarity with the way these minds are moving and relating to the world on objective and subjective levels.
Yeah, I do want to mention a really great way if you're having trouble getting into Ulysses is to get an audiobook, especially an audiobook that is read by many different people.
Oh, yeah.
Because, yeah, if you get a really good actress reading Molly's monologue at the end, it's
Well,
just
let's recommend this Irish radio version of Ulysses. Do you know it?
Yes, I do.
It's unbelievably perfectly done. I don't know how you could do it. I don't know how you could separate the parts into speaking voices, because so many of them are internal monologues, but they do, and it seems like it's a magic to me the way they've done it. The actors are fantastic, and the whole thing is realized beautifully. So I would, and that's available through YouTube, I think, on YouTube.
Yeah, it is. And there's also a couple of on Libro FM. There's a couple of really nice readings of Ulysses. Okay, so we're going to move into party mode up here, and I wish you were here, Reed, to have a piece of cake.
I'm missing that blue cake.
Well, I've got to figure out a way to show the cake to the folks who are here on the
Zoom. I think just lift it up the camera, because if we lose them now, we're not the Food Network. I know some people like to watch people cook and eat, but we're going to end with a view. Kendra, one of our wonderful library patrons and volunteers, baked this cake, and she's also, by the way, if you're interested, and she runs our cookbook club, and our newest author that's going to be celebrated is also here at this event. So after we see the cake, I'm going to sign off from this recording. Thank you everyone so much for attending via Zoom. I know it's not always the exact same experience, and send us any emails if you would like any follow-up information. And also a little hint, we have another great program coming up, but we're going to jump from Ireland to the UK. And if anybody can guess who this is, you get an award. The Hitchhikers to the Galaxy. Who will we be celebrating next? Yes, we're going to be changing tone, and Jeanette's going to be taking that one.
There, can you see that?
Not yet.
That's what's missing.
Yeah. Don't pop the cake. There we go. That is all fun.
Can you see it?
You can see me, but you can't see the cake. Let's see. Make that. There we go. Look at that. So here's Ulysses. Here's the hat. Isn't that amazing?
That's awesome.
And it's edible. We're digestible in some of the passages.
Right.
Thank you, everyone, so much. And I'm going to sign off. And thank you again.
Okay.
Thank you, everybody. Kendra, right over here, made that cake. Kendra, stand up. It's just gorgeous.